We're going to end out our genetics chapter with polygenic traits, sex-linked disorders, and autosomal disorders, all in Punnett squares. Polygenic traits. These are the coolest things in genetics to most people. It's all the stuff that's on a big, long sliding scale. Eye color is the one that comes to most people's minds, so let's take a look at the chart over here. You know that you don't have blue eyes or brown eyes. You can have many, many colors of eyes. So you can have very, very dark brown, all kinds of medium browns, goldeny browns. You can have blues and greens, and then an almost pale white blue. So from the very, very lightest color, blue, all the way up to a dark browny black. That's what polygenic traits do. And look at the way that they're represented. You're going to end up with 2 alleles from mom and 2 different alleles from mom, then 2 alleles from dad and 2 different alleles from dad. In other words, the A gene and the B gene both coming from both mom and dad. Let's take a look at the difference. There are a lot of genetic traits that only require 1 allele per parent. So that would be like widow's peak. You have it or you don't. Whereas skin pigmentation is polygenic, more than 1 gene per parent. In other words, maybe you have a really light-skinned mom with a really dark-skinned dad. That child isn't necessarily going to look like dad or like mom, but could be anywhere on the spectrum between mom and dad. Why? Because mom is going to give 2 or more traits, dad is going to give 2 or more traits, and that's going to put the child on a sliding scale. Blood is probably the one that's most often discussed because A, it's so interesting, and B, because the way that its polygenic traits happen have some dominance and recessive, and then some co-dominance. Let's take a look at the possible genotypes. I know that some of you may have heard that your blood can be positive or negative, but for right now, we're not going to discuss that. Let's just look at the genotypes. We'll talk about positive and negative later. So let's say that there's only A, B, AB, and O blood. The only recessive blood type is O. Do you see how both of the alleles are lowercase? Then, when you get up here to A has 2 possibilities. A is dominant over O, so you can be AA or AO, and that's going to give you A-type blood. I know that this I is here in the front. For some reason, when doing blood types, they use I to represent the allele and then A to represent the actual trait given by the particular parent. So if you have A blood, you can have homozygous A or heterozygous A. When you have B, you can have homozygous B or heterozygous B. Where it gets interesting is that A and B are not dominant over each other, only over O blood. Thereby, you can be AB blood. Then, if you get the recessive from both mom and dad, you can be O blood or II. When we think about AB, I want you to think about the spotted chickens. Let's say A is black and B is white, you get a spotted chicken. Or in this case, if A is A blood and B is B blood, the child is going to have AB blood. Now comes the positive and the negative, which is actually called RH factor or the rhesus factor. And this is going to be a protein that's actually found on the outside of the red blood cell, and it's inherited. Almost all people are RH positive. RH negative is much rarer. When RH really matters the most is in 2 situations. Number 1, if you're getting a blood transfusion, or number 2, if you're a pregnant woman. If the woman is RH positive and the baby is RH negative, that can cause pregnancy complications that doctors just need to make the mother aware of. Here is a blood compatibility, because one of the other things that everybody loves to talk about is what kind of blood can I receive if I were ever in an accident? Now, we have two very distinct things on this chart that are incredibly important. O negative. O negative is the universal donor. It means that if you are O negative, every single human being on earth can receive your blood. Why? Because O is recessive, and so it can be covered over by um, any of the other ones. In other words, if you receive an O transfusion, because there's no proteins on the outside of that O blood, A blood accepts it, B blood accepts it, O positive blood accepts it, AB accepts it, and so do all of the positive and negative varieties in there. Then there is a universal receiver. The universal receiver means that they can receive blood from everyone. This means that if you have AB positive blood, you can receive from anyone on this chart. Notice how in the receives category, O negative is the most restrictive. Even though they can give to everyone, they can actually only receive from themselves. So if you have O negative blood, oftentimes people will actually have their own personal supply at their local hospital, because O negative blood is something that everyone can receive, and it's very popular in transfusions. Now, let's do a blood type problem. I'll let you read the problem, I'll wait a moment, and then I'll show you the Punnett square that results. Parent 1, parent 2, children. You can see that there is a 50% chance that the child will have O blood. If you care about the other 50%, even though that's not what the question asked, the other 50% would be heterozygous A blood. More on polygenic inheritance. When we have these multiple alleles that fall into place with certain characteristics, like fruit, we're going to have this information that capital A, capital A, capital B, i.e. all dominant traits, are going to produce a fruit weighing 4 pounds. Let's pretend it's a squash. Over here, when you have lowercase a, lowercase a, lowercase b, that's going to produce fruits weighing 2 pounds each. That means that each of these traits has some kind of a weight associated with it. If we have a squash with AA, BB, it weighs 4 pounds. Lower A, lower B, 2 pounds. So again, what do each of these traits weigh independently? A is about a pound, B is about a pound, lowercase a 1/2 pound, lowercase b 1/2 pound. So the dominant trait literally gives a squash twice as much weight as a recessive trait. So let's solve some problems. What if you had a squash like this? What would it weigh? About 3.5 pounds. What about a squash like this? About 3 pounds. Now we're going to get on to sex-linked traits. Sex-linked mean that they are tied to one sex or the other. Remember, in humans, we have XX for female and XY for male. This really comes significantly into play when we actually look at what those items look like, what those sex chromosomes look like. When we look at the sex chromosomes themselves, you notice that the X chromosome is large and the Y chromosome is quite short. We can see this when we look at the typical karyotype, and then this is an actual photograph of an X chromosome and a Y chromosome done under an electron microscope, I believe. So here's your picture for that. Look at how much material is missing off the Y chromosome. If you're curious about the Y chromosome and you'd like to know why that chromosome is shrinking and disappearing, I actually stuck a little article in here. It's not mandatory reading, but it's actually kind of fascinating. So if that's an interest to you, there's an article for you to learn some more. Now, because the X chromosome is smaller, men have less genetic material on that chromosome, thereby they are more apt to inherit disorders. Let's look at why that is. If a woman has this recessive trait for whatever disorder we're discussing, she has the other one to block it. So she's what we call a carrier. She has the possibility to have the disorder. Over here, the man. The man is also heterozygous, and he has a big R and a little r. When we look at all of their offspring, the girl right here, she's homozygous dominant, does not have the trait, is not a carrier. This girl blocks it, so she's a carrier. This girl also blocks it, so she's a carrier. Only 1 in 4 girls would have the opportunity to actually have the disorder when both the mother is a carrier and the father is going to have the genetic disorder. Sex-linked inheritance. Color blindness is a classic example. More men are colorblind than women, and here's a Punnett square that shows why. When you're XX, you have 2 opportunities to block color blindness. This mom carries the recessive gene. The father's actually not colorblind, but notice how he only has 1 section. The Y will never receive an allele for this because the Y chromosome does not carry an allele for colorblindness, only the X. So women are much less likely to actually be colorblind. In fact, really the only way for a girl to be colorblind is if the mother is colorblind and the father is also colorblind. So women are much, much less likely to be colorblind because they need both the allele from the mother and from the father to be colorblind. Another example is hemophilia. Notice how the woman carries, the man is a hemophiliac, so this daughter is safe. This daughter is a hemophiliac, getting the affected gene from mom and the affected gene from dad. This boy is normal because he gets the unaffected one from mom. This boy has hemophilia because he gets it from mom. He only needs 1 hemophiliac trait, whereas the girl needs 2. It is much, much less common for a girl to be a hemophiliac than it is for a boy, again, because she needs 2 copies of the affected gene while he only needs 1. See how the Y does not carry it? Why? Because the Y chromosome is so much smaller and that allele literally does not exist on the Y chromosome, so it cannot block the affected gene. Autosomal disorders. Remember, autosomal disorders are everything else, and they can be both dominant and recessive. So in other words, when we're talking about autosomal recessive, this means that you must get the recessive gene from the mother and the recessive gene from the father. So generally, if both parents are carriers, 25% of the offspring will have it. Cystic fibrosis is an example. Here is a Punnett square showing the possibilities. In other words, 2 children can carry, but because the mother does not carry, no children can have the disorder. Autosomal dominant is actually pretty horrific, and there's not very many examples of it. Why? Because if you get 1 single copy, you get the disease, and usually the disease is fatal. Huntington's disease is an example. So here is a Punnett square for Huntington's disease. Every single child here, because 1 parent has the disorder and is homozygous dominant, all children will have the disorder. 100% will inherit the disease. Here is a review slide, and if you're interested in pedigrees, you can take a look